Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Early, and I'm the Dean of the UTS Business School. And a very warm welcome to tonight's webinar with our very special guest, Professor Michael Spence. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I would also like to pay respect to elders both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Now, to our very special guest, and a tremendous honor for me to introduce. Professor Michael Spence is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and Philip H. Knight Professor and Dean Emeritus at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. In 2001, Mike was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his contributions to the analysis of markets with asymmetric information. He's the chairman of an independent commission on growth and development created in 2006 and focused on growth and poverty reduction in developing countries. He has served as a member of the boards of directors of General Mills, Cyber Systems, Nike, Exult, and a number of private companies. He's a member of the American Economic Association and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometric Society. I could go on, but it's my great pleasure and wonderful honor to welcome Professor Mike Spence to present to us The World After the Pandemic, Convergence or Divergence. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'm going to have a few slides. So there we go. There. Can everybody see this? Huh.
Yes, looks very good.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted, Chris, I'm delighted to be with you. I'm sorry it's not in person. You and I and Bruce McCurd and others were hoping to do this in person, and maybe we can sometime in the future. So what I guess the first thing I want to say, I'm going to cover a fair amount of material here, but I'm going to leave the slides with you and some other references for anybody on the meeting who's interested. But I've come to believe that it's very difficult to predict the post-pandemic future economically or in other dimensions if you don't have a sense of what's going to happen as we sort of exit from this. And so I'm going to spend some time on that at the start. So the topics I'd like to cover, if I could make my screen go home, is I'd like to talk about a project that I've been involved in that was originated at an academy in Hangzhou called Tracking the Pandemic Economy in Real Time. And just because it'll give us a sense of, how this the coevolution of the economy and the pandemic is turning out in a variety of countries. I've put in the kind of website reference. This is a remarkable piece of work using big data. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about digital trends and acceleration, and that obviously relates to the post-pandemic economy. And finally, maybe some words, and I know there'll be some questions about the global architecture that we are going to live with afterwards. So, there's been a lot of discussion about what kinds of, what's the economy going to, what is the evolution of the economy, various economies going to look like. I think in the early stages, people thought, well, this will come and go and we'll have something vaguely resembling a V-shaped recovery. I think most people now think that's, not everyone, but most people think that's relatively unlikely. And so this is a kind of, rough and ready graphical description of the stages of a pandemic economy. So you have time on the horizontal axis and the economic contraction. And what it looks like is that, most countries, with a few exceptions, got a late start. The virus kind of got out of control. Then some pretty aggressive measures, lockdown, social distancing, business closures, were put in place, producing really quite dramatic drops in economic activity. And then there's a trough. And the trough is important because it has varying lengths in different economies. And the longer this trough is, the longer an economy stays in this trough, the greater the damage and the greater the risk of permanent damage to the economy. After that, I think, I think humility requires us all to say nobody knows, and certainly not with certainty, but it looks like the recovery patterns are going to be relatively slow, some variation across countries. And then there's some sectors that are really quite difficult to restore, like international air travel and so on. So there's a kind of long tail. So, I mean, if you sort of had a U-shaped recovery and sat on one side, you'd get a picture that looks like this. And of course, if we have a vaccine that's more or less universally available, that would truncate this picture that I just drew. Just a ready description of various dimensions of the pandemic economy. So from a macroeconomic point of view, I think once governments got into action, so to speak, two things happened. One, whatever trends there were in monetary policy, maybe a very gradual backing off of the monetary easing that we experienced after the great financial crisis, that's all been reversed, dramatically reversed in most places, including, the big economies like the United States and Europe. And the purpose of that was not necessarily to try to restore economic activity through monetary policy. It was to make sure that the huge fiscal programs that most places have adopted to try to buffer the shock of the economy and to protect businesses and most especially people, and enable people who've lost their jobs, people who've been furloughed, et cetera, protect them on the way through. And these numbers are massive, $2 and $3 trillion in the United States, et cetera. So I live in Italy. Our sovereign debt to GDP ratio going into this was 130%, which is pretty high. We're going to come out of it at 160% or more, absent the European central banks easing aggressive monetary stand, that we would be at least in a risky situation and probably worse. And so the main targets of this fiscal program were, rapid expansion of medical capacity where it's needed. Many places are had their medical systems overwhelmed, including where I spent the past 3 months in northern Italy. Buffering the shock, and another important dimension that I'll just touch on in a minute is redistributing the balance sheet damage that's caused by this kind of contraction, especially if it's extended. So what, some people are sort of concerned about this accumulation of public debt. And it's right, people are right to be concerned, but I think on balance, the policymakers have got this right. So you're going to have balance sheet damage in the household, in every sector, household, financial, business, and other. And the question is, where do you want to park it? And these fiscal programs are designed to move a fairly substantial amount of it to the public sector balance sheet. Not because that's a great idea, but because it's better than the alternative of leaving it in the household sector or having business failures and so on, because that produces a much more permanent kind of damage that's harder to recover from. And we know that from the great financial crisis, where we had very large batches of damage to the household sector and it killed demand. I don't know exactly how large these drops are going to be. And when you measure it in GDP terms, it's going to depend very heavily on how fast we recover. But if the United States economy at the low point had dropped 25 to 30%, and we have a recovery that I think reasonably could take to the end of 2021, this is just guesswork. So you've got kind of a 7-quarter episode. You could have damage that's on the order of a quarter of 2019 GDP, plus or minus. So That's on the order of $5 to $6 trillion in the American economy. We're talking big numbers here. Let me turn to the pandemic economy fundamentals. Basically, people have been hunting around for sort of historical examples of this, but I don't think there are any very good ones. So mobility, business closure, sector shutdowns essentially reduce both supply and demand simultaneously very quickly in this drop-off, this cliff that we just saw a minute ago. But there's another factor constraining the economic recovery, even when you start to open up, that is, remove the mandates that require business closures, physical distancing, and all that kind of thing, and that is risk and risk aversion. And it's really important. I mean, not everybody has the same degree of risk aversion, but significant portions of populations are going to be reluctant to return to economic activities that involve frequent close contact with other people, and that's going to present a headwind to the recovery. If you think about the risk side of this as a challenge, where you want to reduce risk, then you've got basically three levers. You can reduce the risk of transmission or infection when you have contact between an infected person and another potential contact, and that's this physical or social distancing. You can rig the economy up in the opening up process so that you basically have as little contact as you can for any given level of economic activity. What that really means is you open things up that have more limited required contact and don't have huge gatherings, especially indoors. And the third one is you want to reduce the prevalence of the virus among the people who are in circulation. And the way you do that, the kind of old-fashioned way, is by testing, tracking, and isolating the positive test cases. Most of the world is doing that relatively badly. Even as we get the virus under control. And most of the world, with the exception of a few Asian countries, have made relatively limited use of digital tools to support that process. So for example, if many of us will have talked to our friends in China, in most Chinese cities now, people are walking around with what amounts to a mobile health certificate. And it's a QR code that's color coded. And if it's green, you can move around. And if it's not green, you can't, period. And it's based on a massive amount of data that we probably couldn't use in most of the so-called Western countries because of concerns about privacy and distrust of government and so on. But if you think of what we're doing in those terms, they've managed to take out the high-risk people from the mobile population, and that, in terms of the risk aversion I just mentioned, makes people more comfortable in returning to normal kind of economic activity. How did I get there? I apologize. So here we go. The other thing I wanted to mention before I tell you about the pandemic economy tracking project is the distributional impacts. It's pretty clear, I think, to those who've thought about this, that the biggest impact is going to occur in most of our countries on the lower part of the income and wealth distribution. Just to give you an example, there's a study was done early on in the pandemic by two faculty members at the University of Chicago, and they asked a simple question: what fraction of jobs in the United States can be done by working from home? And the answer they came up with is roughly a third. I mean, it's a rough and ready study because they did it pretty fast. And then they looked at it by geography, and then they looked at it, and this is the dramatic part, by sector. So you can see that, at least for a while, educational services can function remotely, and a bunch of other things that are listed at the top on the left-hand side. And at the bottom, you have sectors where the lion's share of the jobs require people to be physically present. So take the bottom one, which is accommodation and food services, what's normally called hospitality. This is a workforce that runs between 16 and 17 million people in the United States. And their estimate is that 4% of the jobs in that sector can be done working from home, which means essentially, and these are sectors that have essentially been shut down. So, and we know from other data that the people who work in this sector are at the lower end of the income distribution. So it doesn't take very long to figure out that the people in essential services who have been at risk, people who are working in sectors that have been shut down, are going to have the biggest impacts. And of course, the social safety nets and these massive fiscal programs that have been put in place are designed to mitigate that damage. And I think with lots of imperfections, especially on the implementation side, you know, they've managed to do that. So I actually think this is at least a partial success, if not more. This is a picture that comes from my friends in Hangzhou about testing rates. It's not completely up to date, but you can see that there's a fairly big difference in testing rates per 1,000 people across a wide range of countries. But I think the main takeaway here is that except for a few Asian countries that got the virus early and used very heavy testing as part of the program to contain the virus, almost everybody else kind of missed that opportunity and had to deal with a period in which testing and containment wasn't really an option. I think it's probably right to think of this thing as running through the global economy in waves. So this is just a picture of, you know, the share of the confirmed cases across the world by region. So you start out where the virus started in East Asia, and they had 100% of it for a while, and now they're almost vanished. And then, as you can see from the graph, Middle East and North Africa and Western Europe took over, and then Oceania, North America, and now this wave, and this is again, this one stops at in the latter part of May. If we ran this through to June now, those red and pinkish areas would be much bigger. The virus is really now just roaring through what amount to the developing countries, ex-China. So what is this tracking project? Basically, here's the challenge. The people, policymakers and politicians, our leaders, the people we elect, are the people who have to make these very difficult decisions about when and how and in what order to open up an economy. We know this is a risky exercise, but we know you can't sort of go to the extremes. You can lock down the economy until you're absolutely sure the virus is gone, but that produces an enormous amount of economic damage and suffering on the part of people. And if you think of poorer countries in the global economy, basically you can't lock them down without putting people's livelihoods and ability to survive at risk. So the idea is you want to have a way of keeping track of how you're doing in terms of the virus and the economy simultaneously. And the challenge for that, we've got lots of data on the virus. It may be imperfect, for sure, because we don't know simple things like how many actual cases do we have as opposed to reported cases and so on. But we know that, we just have to live with that uncertainty. But our conventional measures of economic performance come with too big a lag. We have maybe reasonably frequent reports on unemployment, but in many economies, unemployment is not a very relevant figure for what's actually happening to the workforce because of the informal economy. GDP gets reported quarterly, mainly, and that's, it's not useless, but if you're trying to make, week by week decisions, which is what the prime ministers and leaders in various countries and governors and states are trying to do, You need a much more real-time picture of what's going on, both with respect to the virus and the economy. So this is what these folks have been trying to do, and I just left you some websites, is to try to track that. And this is what it looks like. The key insight here is that for most of the global economy, and specifically 132 countries, that we have very good mobility data by type of activity, mostly from Google, and it's published. It's extremely detailed, and it turns out that mobility is a reasonably good proxy, just using ordinary regression analysis, for what's going on in terms of economic activity. And so the notion is, I mean, there's other data you could use, but it's specific to particular economies. In China, you could use the mobile payments and e-commerce data to get and logistics data to get a pretty good picture of what's going on in the economy, but it doesn't generalize easily. So this is based primarily on mobility data, and I've shown you a kind of representative graph. I'm going to show you a bunch of others on the right-hand side here. And basically, on the vertical axis, you have an estimate based on mobility data of the size of the contraction. And on the horizontal axis, instead of having time, you have the number of days. They call it doubling days. It's specifically, it's how many days, if you take a particular day and you ask, how many days do you have to go back in time before you get to the point where you've doubled the number of reported confirmed new infections? And this is a kind of variant of measuring something like, RT. It's basically, and the notion is that as this number gets bigger, you're not doubling as fast. And the estimate that they've made is that if you're in the sort of 19-day range, you're roughly in the area where the number of new infections is exceeded by the number of recoveries. So think of that, if you can see that vertical line, just a little dotted line there, that's at day 19. If you're to the left of that, you're in some degree of trouble with respect to the spread of the virus. If you're if you're doubling every 10 days, it's pretty much out of control, let alone 5. And so you can see when people start into this program, it is out of control for the most part. This graph happens to depict the Chinese. And then as you go along that line, and on the website, you can actually do this, by hovering the cursor over it. I won't try to do this now, but you can basically see how many days along you are as you go along this graph. So here's the first wave. If you think of the waves as East Asia, including China, and then the second wave, the developed economies, and the third wave, a whole bunch of developing economies in Africa, Latin America, and so on. This is the first wave. So the China case is fairly typical, but extreme. I mean, so big drop, a very aggressive lockdown, quite successful containment of the virus, and then they sort of started an opening up process and crossed relatively quickly, on the order of 40, 45 days into the area where the virus is starting to be under control. And here you can see this slightly bumpy, gradual sort of recovery process. The other economies here are the subset that got on it early and managed to contain the virus before it got out of control. Here's I can't do all the countries, so here's an example. Here's Europe, America, and Oceania. So you can see, probably some of you are interested in Australia. That's the sort of light green line. Substantial drop in the economy. This is a pretty successful looking program because there's been a fairly rapid transition into the high doubling days number, which means getting out of the danger zone, and compared to other economies, a relatively modest drop, estimated based on mobility data in economic activity. So that's, you'd chalk that up as an impressive kind of performance. If you look at Italy, where I am, that's the light blue line at the bottom. We had an enormously large drop because the virus really was out of control, and we spent a long time in lockdown at those very low levels of economic activity relative to normal. And we're 85 days into this, and we're still, you know, probably down 12, 13% in terms of economic activity. These graphs are slightly out of date, and for the up-to-date ones, you can find them on the Luan Academy website. Here's a second wave thing again. So you see, Sweden's the commentary on Sweden keeps swinging back and forth from, you know, dreadful to great, depending on who's writing and what time period you're looking at. But Sweden, I think, is known for having used a less aggressive approach to locking down the economy, so that the economic drop is lower. But you can see France is way down there. Germany is the blue line in the middle. So also a pretty successful case. Again, I wanted to introduce this, not analyze it. This is the Middle East and North Africa. And here you see, here you see a pattern that you're going to see again. And it's the most worrying kind of pattern. So, I mean, a good pattern is, you know, medium to largest drop, rapid transition to the right, followed by steady progress moving up and to the right, as you look at the graph. Less good, the Italian case, big drop, long time staying down to get the virus under control, and then a difficult, you know, movement to the right. But sorry, but if you look at this graph, and specifically the yellow line, Egypt, this is a fairly substantial drop, followed by a reversion. So the virus, you know, kind of started to double faster than before. And they've now spent 77 days in the virus as of the date of this graph, which is late May, is still what you might call in the danger zone. So it's basically, you're having an economic contraction of significance followed by lack of success in controlling the virus. And so if you were making choices about how to deal with this economy, it would be pretty important to know both where you are economically, but this is a recovery without controlling the virus. So it's what you don't see in any of the developed countries. If you look at South and Southeast Asia, again, let me take the Indian case. So India is this light blue line here, big drop, very aggressive, shutting down. Came fairly late in the cycle, but and then they started to progress in controlling the virus. But India has an enormous number of migrant workers who can't, you know, make it in terms of if you shut down Mumbai, you know, basically what happened is people couldn't stay alive, so they started going back to their rural origins. That has spread the viruses to the rural area. If I updated this graph, India would be opening up somewhat, and over here, you know, making progress toward controlling the virus, but still in this kind of danger zone. And you can see Indonesia, thus far anyway, is, I'm sorry, Pakistan here is in a similar situation. So I guess the eye opener for me in looking at all this is that as you scan across the countries, you see I think the worst pattern that you hope you don't see, which is significant negative economic impact followed by real challenges in getting the virus under control. And you will see the same thing in Latin America. So the red line is Peru. The blue line here is Argentina, and Brazil is this light blue line. So less significant contraction, but it's kind of meandering around here in the doubling days. And as of the date of this, they're not much over 10. It's very hard to know what's going to happen in these economies. But one scenario, which is that I think you have to admit, is that absence very significant external support of some kind. Remember, these economies don't have fiscal space. They don't have, many of them don't have medical facilities that are adequate to cover a big surge in the economy, in the virus. You may get economic recoveries with the virus still out of control. From an economic point of view, that's certainly possible. This virus is not something that by itself kills an economy, you know, or sets it back, but it will be a humanitarian catastrophe for sure. And here's Africa, and the scaling here is different, but you can see the same pattern that we saw in some other developing countries, which is, you know, the dark blue line here is Egypt. So contraction of 15%, some progress, reversion, and then moving in this direction, but still doubling as of the late May at 15 days, which means that the virus is approaching being controlled, but definitely not under control. Dave Brady, whom you're going to hear from, I think, you know, sometime in July, and I have been trying to track a variety of measures using survey data of how governments are doing. I mean, the general point is probably worth mentioning. We wrote a short article on this. Is that the survey data from 2015 to 2020, having to do with trust, not only in government, but other institutions, is not very encouraging over a very wide range of countries. So I put in a couple of graphs. So this is survey data related to how's your government doing in handling and making sensible decisions in handling both the economy and the virus, i.e. the pandemic economy. So Australia here is looking pretty good, and I think deservedly so. The other ones here are the UK, and the UK has been declining, and now is sort of somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% approval, and that's where Mexico is as well. I got a couple other graphs, I won't belabor them, but so this is North America. And Canada, again, is, I always thought Canada, where I grew up, and Australia were rather similar countries, you know, relatively small population, huge land mass, massive amounts of natural resources, minerals and other things, and so on. And, you know, on balance, pretty good governance. So it shows here. The United States, we'll all have your own views of that, and I'm an American citizen, so I should probably be relatively quiet, but this has not been one of our finest performances so far. And now there are patterns of rising reported infections in approximately 20 states in the United States. So it's pretty clear that at the state level, we're starting to open up too soon. And the federal government is largely, from the point of view, the administration dropped out of this. So this has not been our finest hour so far. And here you have a few European countries. The numbers vary here. Italy, interestingly, which is not famous for having highly competent and stable governments, has been doing reasonably well on this one, according to the survey data. These are citizens reporting. I'm shifting gears now. One of the things that's become obvious, and I'm going to try not to use up too much time here, is that that the pandemic economy has accelerated certain kinds of economic activity. And probably the most obvious example of that is digital in a variety of dimensions and sectors. There's lots of evidence for this. So that a number of digital technology companies, including the one we're using now, have done pretty well in the markets. So I just put pictures here of Zoom and Amazon and PayPal and Apple just as representative examples. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this because everybody knows it. But I think, you know, what's driving this is really two things. One, resilience in this context was really dependent on digital technologies. I mean, if you kind of hypothetically remove them and ask, you know, well, how would you do if you locked down an economy with no working from home, no schooling from home, you know, no e-commerce, no mobile payment systems, you know, no online banking and whatnot? I mean, the answer is probably you couldn't do it. So at multiple levels, you know, international, national, business, et cetera, there's just a growing awareness that resilience has been, or the major contributor to resilience to the extent we've had it, has been the digital technologies. Well, I've been following this because a company I'm associated with as an advisor is part of this, but I just mentioned it. This in the middle of a pandemic in a country that, you know, is battling to get the virus under control. We have, you know, the largest, fastest batch of investment and pretty much ever in digital technology. Geo, as most of you know, is the digital platform mobile phone part of Reliance Industries. That's Mukesh Ambani's company. It's the core of the company is or used to be oil, energy. But he, in 2015 or 16, moved into this sector. And we've had roughly $13 billion invested in the geo digital platform technologies by the companies listed here. It's really quite extraordinary. And that's all happened within a 2-month period. So I think I cite it not only to suggest that people have sort of figured it out, that there's going to be a major acceleration in the adoption of digital technologies pretty much everywhere in the world, as long as the infrastructure will support it. And that's perhaps not surprising. So kind of my take on what the effect of the pandemic economy in this respect is that it amplifies, reinforces, and accelerates existing trends. Those aren't the only effects, but those are important ones. And specifically, with respect to digital technologies, we've known ever since the internet became kind of a publicly available resource that the hallmark characteristics of these technologies is that distance doesn't really matter, and you don't have time delays, and you sort of eliminate the costs associated with remoteness. In the pandemic economy, remoteness suddenly became a much more local phenomenon. I mean, if you had said before we had this experience, well, I mean, we knew we could send emails and, you know, text messages to people who are standing beside us or in the office next door, but it didn't really make much difference. And all of a sudden it did. And so the way I think about it, there's going to be a lot of research on this, so this is just preliminary thinking, is that in any system, you have inertia. And it's basically just reluctance to experiment and reluctance to undertake change when it isn't deemed to be necessary. And what the pandemic economy does is force those experiments and changes, and it accelerates them. Um, there's economists use the term substitutes and complements. I think what the pandemic economy has done in a number of sectors is force us to use digital technologies as substitutes for what would otherwise be, offline, physical activity. But when we get out of this, I think what's going to happen is that a bunch of experiments are going to have occurred, and people are going to revert to a set of models that I call hybrid models, where you think of the digital technologies, which now people are more familiar with and have used and are comfortable with and have new ideas about, that function as complements. So think of education. Virtually all of us have been forced into online education, regardless of the level, starting with elementary school and going all the way through university. Nobody thinks that the online model, full stop by itself, is an ideal model. On the other hand, we've learned a great deal about using digital technology. So I expect that we will end up with different hybrid models that use, in-person and online or digital capabilities in very different ways as we emerge from this and build the lessons that we've learned into the models. And this is occurring in just almost all over the place. So the adoption of e-commerce has been accelerated dramatically. Almost all retail, it's well known that retail, the portion of the retail sectors that did better in weathering the pandemic economy storm were the ones that had a digital footprint or quickly acquired it. So I would think that the adoption of digital hybrid models in retail, all of retail, restaurants, everything, will be accelerated. Surely mobile payments and related enabled fin have been enabled. I mean, it was quite interesting to me that PayPal, somewhere in the middle of this, essentially adopted the Chinese QR code mobile payment system as one of the options they supply. Education, we just talked about. Work, I mean, patterns of work. My friends in New York say nobody's in a rush to go back to the office. And if you say, well, why? Because they're allowed to do that now. Well, they're only a third or a quarter of the people are there, and they've learned enough about working remotely that they're asking themselves kind of what's the point? And there's speculation that will kind of depopulate the sort of mega cities and so on. I think that's a bit extreme, but there's a whole lot of uncertainty at the moment about what kind of work is going to look like. Digital in healthcare was a trend that was already underway, but I think it's one of the major things we can expect in the pandemic economy in every dimension you can imagine. Telemedicine. Do you really need to go? There are lots of stories associated with this. If you can do just as well online, especially with enhanced testing capability, why not? I mean, in where I live in northern Italy, during the pandemic, doctors were telling people not to go to the hospital unless they were desperately sick. And the reason was it was more dangerous to do that than it was to stay home and hope you recover. And there's going to be residual elements of that. And similarly, digital is going to be part of the kind of resilience movement that we're going to experience. So let me conclude with a couple of comments on the global economy. When I'm asked about this, I think the easiest, nothing's easy in terms of forecasting here, but I think the easiest thing to kind of start with is to find those areas where the pandemic has reinforced or amplified or accelerated forces in existing trends. And in the global economy, the trends were negative, right? I mean, we were experiencing fragmentation, increasing tensions, tension spreading out from goods and services to capital flows to technology, even to people flows, all the dimensions of kind of globalization. And I think most people had come to the conclusion that even if we don't know the destination, it's not going to be a return to where we started and lived in the post-war period for the better part of 60 or 70 years. I think the pandemic economy is a best guess is that it will exacerbate those negative trends. Now, optimists, and I tend to be one, kind of hope that when you have an event like this, sometimes you'll do an about face, and there'll be an increasing awareness of the benefits of international cooperation in a number of dimensions. And there are some positive signs. I mean, I've been impressed that the global scientific and medical community has pretty much acted in a totally open way in trying to deal with this. And that's very encouraging. So maybe we'll do an about face. I mean, here in Europe, the Chancellor Merkel and President Macron in France have said, if there's ever a time when we're going to sort of stop acting like we, are just a bunch of countries with a free trade agreement and some mobility in terms of people and really act like we're all in it together, this should be the time. And they have a proposal essentially to use the fiscal power of the European Union, fiscal and borrowing power, to try to mitigate the damage. That's not passed yet, but if that went through, that could, with the benefit of hindsight, historically be viewed as a real turning point in the trajectory of Europe and European unification. So it's not all bad. But I think the hope that geopolitical tensions that increasingly have spilled over into technology, that those will go away is probably, not terribly realistic. I've written a little bit about this, so I'll just say a word. I don't have any question that resilience, in terms of food, health, and many other dimensions, supply chains, and so on, is going to be more top of mind for countries, for businesses than it was going into this. And I expect that will produce real changes, basically in the objective function. I expect there will be some movement in the direction of sort of self-sufficiency and relocalization in various sectors. Critical medical supplies might be one, and so on. This could be wrong. It could be that we revert and just hope the whole system's open. But I think at the very least, it's reasonable to expect that these considerations they've always been there, but they don't tend to get very much attention in normal times because you're planning for relatively low probability events. So at least for a period of time, I think they'll be top of mind. There's some qualifications to that. If you think in terms of networks, resilience tends to be underinvested in networks which are constructed in a decentralized way. And the reason for that is that resilience is in the network is kind of like a public good. And if you don't really have sufficient incentives for individual participants to supply the public good. So we'll see how this goes. The final comment on the slide, that's kind of my final comment, is I'm sure we're going to want to discuss, what do countries like Australia and others do while the United States and China don't get along. But that US-China relationship so far is going very badly. And while I think there's at least a chance post the American election that the American approach to international relations will change in the sense that it won't be necessarily, this obviously would depend on Biden winning the election, won't necessarily be kind of aggressively negative vis-a-vis pretty much everything, international institutions, friends and allies and things like that. What I don't think will happen is a major change in the relationship with China, because the aggressiveness with respect to China and the tensions that go with that are pretty bipartisan in the United States. They're also clearly here in Europe now, and at least according to my reading, there's some of that also in Australia as well. So I think we're in for a pretty bumpy period going forward. I don't think we can blame that on the pandemic, but I don't think we can count on the pandemic to produce a fairly substantial reversal in those trends. So Chris, with that, I'm going to sort of stop the screen sharing and let everybody else into the conversation.
Thanks, Mike. That was a wonderful, very stimulating talk. And I'll give you a quick moment to have maybe a drink of water or a cappuccino right now and relay an incident that I had read online. And I don't know that this is true, but I certainly hope it is. And it's certainly one of those romantic, funny stories that apparently you had when you were at Harvard at one point teaching an economics class. You had Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates in your class. And as the story goes, they actually didn't attend class very much, but ended up cramming for the exam, passing the class. Now, what I think is interesting about this is that your outline, your material was sufficient to propel them to very, very wonderful levels of success. I can only imagine how much more successful they would have been if they had just gone to the damn classes. So I think that it speaks very well for you. And you've had a couple of very, very good success stories, I think.
Thank you.
So with that, let me just again say thank you for a wonderful, stimulating talk. We've got lots of questions. We'll do questions and answer for about 15 minutes. And the first one we've got actually was submitted earlier. This is by David S. And David S. essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but David was asking, Australia's capability and strategic outlook has improved, and it's making a difference in sort of the global economic realities out there. Do you think that Australia's position will be further improved, remain idle, or even squandered if, as a result of all of the economic activities around the pandemic?
It's a very good question. It's also a very hard question. So a lot of countries, including Australia, are wondering sort of what is the fallout effect, at least in the short to medium term, of the aggressive non-cooperation between the United States and China. So let me hazard a guess. I don't think this is adverse. I mean, the short-run impact of tensions that include tensions between China and us. China's just being aggressive, as well as the United States. And there are clear tensions between China and Australia. And China is a big and an important enough part of the global economy that probably, if it goes badly, will produce a negative effect. What I think is going to happen is that, first of all, the center of gravity of the global economy is clearly moving to the Pacific, to Asia, right? Just based on sheer size. And there's a fairly widespread commitment, both concern and commitment, to maintaining some modified version of a relatively open global system to allow a wide variety of countries to thrive and grow. So what I'm kind of expecting is that the Asian countries, the developed ones, but mainly the ASEAN countries, will get together. And I expect Australia to be part of this. And become something of an important leader in maintaining an open global economy, focusing initially on the region, but it's a huge economy with tremendous benefits in terms of, economic openness, globalization in that context. So, and I, I mean, if you push me a little harder, I think that in a way, Australia's role in that could be similar to the role that the UK had in the European Union before they decided to drop out. I mean, if you live here, the European Union benefited enormously from the kind of British approach to how you deal with markets and whatnot. Europe has a tendency to kind of turn inward, pay too much attention to social safety nets and not enough to innovation. It's a balancing act, right? I mean, the social safety nets are a pretty important strength here. But I think, Australia is a really dynamic economy with common law judicial system. It just could be an enormously important player in building what I think of as the kind of next main part of the global economy, in a modified rules-based system that it runs with. Now, whether Australians are up for that task, I mean, I'm not a citizen, so I don't really know, but that would be my kind of hope for direction. Every economy is going to go through big structural changes. And so making sure you're not falling behind in that dimension is pretty important. And a country like Australia or even Canada, which has huge natural resources, has some, Dutch-like disease, hurdles to overcome in diversifying the economy and so on. But I think those are manageable.
Yeah. So next question, I'll do one of our questions online. This one's actually coming from our own, one of our own deputy vice chancellors at the UTS, Glenn Whitewick. And Glenn's asking, what do you think will happen economically if a vaccine can't be developed?
So that's an area of considerable uncertainty, as far as I can tell. Look, I'm not an expert, but I've been reading as much as I can, like a lot of other people. And so the question is, if there is no vaccine, then does this virus and its various mutations become a permanent part of our life, or does it go away in the way that SARS basically sort of appeared to go away anyway, or SARS-1. And I don't think the scientific community has converged on an answer to that question. So I think people are behaving as if we don't have a vaccine, we have a long, difficult struggle, and eventually we eliminate it. But until they decide whether we acquire immunity, if we've been infected, how long that immunity lasts, whether there are enough mutations so it just comes back and attacks us again. I mean, I at least in my reading, I haven't found an answer to any of those critical questions yet. So I think the honest answer is we don't know.
Well, this is, again, one of those, let's put on your hat to speculate. As a Nobel Prize winner, you're allowed to speculate a lot more than the rest of us. What parts, if you look longer term on the economic ramifications and a number of the graphs that you showed earlier, what parts of the world do you think are most likely to be affected as a result of this longer term? Would it be highly globalized economies like Singapore? Would it be mixed economies like in Latin America? The biosecurity bubbles like we have in Australia and New Zealand? Would it be places like the United States that have additional challenges around diversity, unrest, and political turmoil? Can you kind of speculate longer term which regions may have the most problems?
No, I'm happy to do that, but I have to tell you a story. So in 2001, when they announced the Nobel Prizes, and in economics, George Akerlof and Joe Stiglitz and I were lucky enough to be chosen. Myron Scholes, who had received the Nobel Prize 3 or 4 years earlier, we were colleagues at Stanford, as everybody knows, and he kind of got a hold of me and he said, I have 2 pieces of advice for you. I said, okay. And he said, you're supposed to give a lecture. They're actually serious about this. You should do it. and take it seriously. And I said, okay. And I said, what's the second one? And he said, when you receive a Nobel Prize, people think you know everything about everything. And I looked at him and he said, but you don't, actually. So you have to learn to say, I don't know. And I thought that was great advice. So the countries I'm most worried about, as many of you know, I wrote a book called The Next Convergence, is that the pandemic economy is going to be an enormous setback for the countries that are having trouble dealing with it, what I showed you on the graph. In part because a failure to deal with it may not be directly fatal from an economic point of view, but it will cause them to be further isolated in the kind of global economy sense. And we know the global economy is a key part of any successful growth strategy. And it may cause, you know, social unrest and kind of governance problems and so on. So I think for me, and I even worry about whether this truncates what I viewed as a almost inevitable but difficult pattern of convergence, meaning the countries becoming slowly over decades, you know, more and more advanced, and eventually like those of us who are lucky enough to live in relatively high income countries. So I mean, I'm hoping that's wrong, but I think there's some serious worries, and it's going to depend a lot on whether the international community, despite our differences, can get together and actually help them, right? Help them deal with the virus, help them deal with the, you know, the economic challenges, expand the fiscal space, and so on. But that one worries me. I think Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, places that are well governed, have not been damaged by this, are in quite good shape. I mean, everybody is going to suffer. And everybody who has any participation in the global economy is going to suffer. And in the fact that, you know, the global economy is just going to take a hit. So there's no way to hide from that. But relatively speaking, I think pretty good shape. China, I think, is a mixed picture. I think economically it's a dynamo. I mean, in critical technologies, especially the digital ones, you know, you've got two main players. Europe has fallen just terribly far behind in technology. So on that dimension, I think that, and there's lots of talent and competence and whatnot. I think the thing that would truncate China's future is if their aggressiveness externally is such that, you know, there's a broad-based turning against them, so they become kind of more isolated. I mean, China's much less dependent on the global economy than they used to be sort of 15 years ago, but that, you know, nobody can, especially when it comes to science and technology, by, you know, living in isolation. So I think in that sense, they're sort of playing a somewhat dangerous game. And we all have friends and colleagues who, you know, wish not only China, but some other countries, including the one I'm a citizen of, would play this game a little differently. But I think that's, and you know, Europe, I don't think it's been pretty successful in the pandemic, you know, control measures on balance. They're just enormous challenges here. It'd be great if they have a turnaround and 15 years from now, Europe is another major player in the global economy acting like a unit. But we got a long way to go before that's a reality as opposed to a hope.
Well, I've got time for one more question, and that's going to come from actually a very good friend of both of ours, from Professor Bruce McKern.
Right.
Bruce, for those that don't know him, he's had a very long career teaching at many, many different universities around the world, including Stanford. He's been a dean at business schools in Australia, and I'm very pleased and honored to have him serving on my advisory, industry advisory board for the UTS Business School. So Bruce asks, India is being cautious about joining the Asian Regional Economic Organization. Do you think India will be inclined to join with others now with the border clashes?
I never, Bruce, it's nice to hear from you. We chit chat on the phone all the time. So I found India kind of difficult to predict, honestly. So you would think that rising tension with China might push them in that direction, but they continue to surprise. I mean, when the WTO foundered in completing essentially any round back 10 years ago, the Doha round, India was one of the major stumbling blocks. There's a kind of independent streak. And then, you know, India declined to join a fairly large kind of regional trading agreement within the last couple of years, which from an economic point of view, unless you think it's basically an extended China entity, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. So would the tensions with China be a negative with respect to India being more receptive to being part of a broader South and East Asian economic organization? You'd think so, but the pattern of kind of going their own way is sufficiently well established that I'm not sure I'd bet my kids' savings on that happening.
Okay. Well, listen, we're at that bewitching hour. Mike, I'd like to thank you so much tonight on behalf of all of the people attending. But I also wanted to just make one quick comment, which is there are often things that deans have to do that aren't so, as you know, having been dean at SBS, that aren't so desirable, but there are some that are few and far between, but are tremendous honors. And being able to have a conversation like this with a Nobel laureate, and you did play it down of, oh, you were lucky enough. No, you weren't lucky enough. Tremendous record across a long lifetime of accomplishments and recognition of such. It's just for all of our audience to realize a Nobel Prize is a very special honor for so very many reasons, but most of which is in an academic context. It's the ultimate recognition by your peers and by the community, the larger international community, of success and contribution and impact. And that your work on signaling earlier on in your career is a great example of that, having helped move the field of economics, but more broadly, many different fields forward. So it's a tremendous honor for us to host you. And thank you so much for taking time out of your Italian adventures. It's just been such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure having you here. Thanks so much, Mike.
My pleasure. Just thrilled.
Thank you.